Well, if we're not to make use of the Scriptures as a means of predicting the end of the world, and if as Christians our primary focus is not on the second coming of Christ, but rather on the mission of evangelization, then how do we as Christians, and especially as Catholics, understand the concept of the end times? Well, to begin with, the theology of the end times is known as eschatology, after the eschaton. Eschatology is the theological discussion or study of what the Scriptures and what the Church teaches with regarding the end times. But eschatology was a term coined by scholars in the 1800s to describe the last things on a personal level. For example, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. The last things on a personal level. But when you look at eschatology in the Scriptures, and what our understanding as followers of Christ should be in terms of eschatology, we don't see it as just something personal, but especially as something general and more universal. For example, in the Old Testament, the prophets did not speak of end times in terms of a personal experience, but an experience for the people of God. In the New Testament, eschatology is not on the individual Christian, but on the experience of the church as a whole. And so that's important to understand how we understand eschatology biblically, that it's not on the personal level, but on the general, more universal level of God's holy people. And we don't understand it in terms of a final end of everything, but we understand it in three ways. One, as a transition period, the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. For example, in the Old Testament, we could see eschatology as dealing with the end of slavery and the beginning of freedom for the people of God. Or a little later in the history of the Old Testament, where the prophets are concerned, eschatology would deal with the end of persecutions or the end of exile and the beginning of God's restoration of the kingdom of Israel. In the New Testament, we could see the Annunciation, the announcement of the angel Gabriel to Mary and Zechariah. Eschatologically, we see that as the end of the reign of sin and the beginning of the Messianic era, how we understand the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So it's not just an end outright, but the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. Second, we look at it in terms of a direction in which things are moving. The end of a trip, the end of a journey, or in our case, the end of our journey toward God. We also look at it as a purpose for something. For example, we say education is an end unto itself, or the end of education is getting a good job or having a particular knowledge of a particular field. For us, we look at things such as the end of creation, the purpose for which creation was created, and that is ultimately unity with God and the salvation under Jesus Christ. And that's an important thing to remember with regard to Christian eschatology, because in that vein we remember again the words of Pope St. John Paul II in an audience that he held, in which he states, "We must not forget that for Christians the eschaton, that is, the final event, is to be understood not only as a future goal, but as a reality which has already begun, with the historical coming of Christ. His passion, death, and resurrection are the supreme event in the history of humanity." So for us as Christians, our understanding of the eschaton is that it has already begun with the death and resurrection of Christ. Creation has already been fulfilled in the paschal mystery of Jesus' death and resurrection. And so when we see people demonstrating with big signs saying, "The end is near," we as Christians can say with all confidence, the end is here, right now. And we have been living in the end times for the better part of the last 2,000 years. Why? Because God created creation. He created the world. God lived within the world. God redeemed the world. And God continues to live among us in redeemed creation. That is the essence of the eschatology that we believe in as Christians. Just as the Jews understood the end times as an end of exile or an end of suffering and a beginning of restoration of the kingdom, so we as Christians see the end times as having its focal point and its center in the death and resurrection of Christ. And we live our lives as Christians and as Catholics, as people of the end times who have been saved. And while we await Christ's return in glory, we recognize the end is here and now because Christ has come. God has visited his people and redeemed the world, fulfilling the purpose, the goal, and the end of creation.